Good evening. I am Jan Clark, a member of Women for Change Indiana, and one of your hosts for this evening's event. I want to open with a little bit of a background on why we're here talking about this issue. Indiana currently does not have a law defining consent. This means that sex without consent is not a crime in Indiana unless there is a proven use of physical force, threat of force, or incapacitation. Loopholes in the Indiana State Code allow businesses with under 15 employees to require that the employer give consent for a workplace assault case to even be brought to court. This loophole prevents many victims of workplace harassment from even bringing their case to court, thereby denying them the justice a trial could provide. And I want to share a couple of sobering statistics. 1 in 5 Hoosier women have experienced sexual assault. And another one, Indiana is the 4th highest in the nation for reported rapes among high school girls. Establishing a statewide definition for consent, which has been a legislative priority of Women for Change, is a first step towards developing legal protection for survivors. And this evening's Listen, Connect, Participate discussion will focus on this issue of consent and sexual assault and what we can do about it. We have a panel of experts who are going to be sharing with us, and I am going to quickly hand off to our moderator for the evening, Danielle Nymphs. Danielle is a passionate public affairs professional dedicated to access for all. She currently serves as the regional field organizer with Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates, a nonprofit organization that protects and promotes reproductive health rights and justice. And they're working to increase the footprint of Planned Parenthood's mission and values, preserving a social and political climate favorable to the exercise of reproductive choice. Danielle has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Master of Public Affairs in Social Change and Innovation from Iupui. And she is actively committed to volunteering for organizations that focus on women's equality, poverty, and youth service. And don't we love her for that as well as need her for all of those things? So without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that wonderful introduction. And good evening, everyone. We will be discussing the political and social landscape around consent in the state of Indiana, as well as the emotional health and well-being considerations. And I'm going to be setting the stage and providing some Zoom logistics. While consent is a very crucial conversation, it is also a sensitive one. And I want to provide a trigger warning to those with us, as we will be discussing topics like rape and sexual violence. Please allow yourself space and grace while discussing with us this evening. First, I want to thank our panelists for being with us and taking time to provide updates and knowledge surrounding consent in Indiana. And another thanks is due to the guests here tonight for being eager and ready for change. And thanks for Women for Change for hosting this conversation and making strides towards defining consent at the state level so that all Hoosiers are protected by law. Like Jan introduced, I am Danielle and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the regional field organizer for Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates. For a great run at this conversation, I will explain how the panel will compose itself. Panelists will have the opportunity to introduce themselves shortly, and we will begin the panel with some questions. I will direct the questions to a single panelist, to all the panelists, or a combination. But panelists, feel free to answer questions not directed at you and provide your thoughts and input. After the panel, we will open the floor for questions to our guests. And guests, when we open the floor for questions, please feel free to use the chat box, the raise hand feature, or come off mute to ask your questions. We do ask that you remain on mute during the panelist portion to minimize background noise and distractions. So let's go ahead and introduce our panelists with us now, and we'll kick it off with Beth. Beth, do you mind introducing yourself?
I am happy to do so. Thank you, Danielle, and good evening, everyone. My name is Beth White. I am currently the president and CEO of the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking. I am day 7 on the job. I started last week. Prior to that, I was the executive director of the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee, working with Mayor Hogsett. I'm just thrilled to be here. I have been a lawyer in Indianapolis for 30 years. I was an elected official for a time. I have worked in government, not-for-profit, the education sector, and I am thrilled to be a part of this important conversation so that we can focus and talk about the important job of protecting survivors of sexual assault. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Beth. And then I'm going to pass it to another great panelist, Christine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Congo. I am currently the Assistant Director of Interpersonal Violence Prevention and Response at the Iupui campus. I'm very excited to be here on this panel, so thank you for Women for Change for inviting me. I'm very passionate about working with survivors, and my background is both in law and in advocacy for survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and human trafficking. So I'm really looking forward to all of us engaging in how we can best support survivors in the community and also on our campuses. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for the work that you're doing with our college students. Due to the nature of the legislative session, Representative Nagel and Representative Hatcher are being detained by meetings and will join us in progress as soon as their House meetings adjourns. But we are joined by Amy Levander, Chair of Craig Duvall Governmental Affairs and Public Advocacy Practices, who can provide legislative information on consent in House Bill 1079. Amy, would you mind going ahead and introducing yourself and giving us some background on House Bill 1079 and how we got here?
Sure. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Women for Change, for having me this evening. As Danielle indicated, my name is Amy Levander, and I serve as a contract lobbyist here in the state. This is my 22nd, I think, legislative session. I'm a former gubernatorial and legislative staffer, and have been a private sector lobbyist for since 2004. In addition to that, I serve as the executive director of Hoosier Women Forward, a Democrat women's leadership training program. So I am, again, delighted to be here. I also serve as Women for Change's contract lobbyist at the State House. And so happy to provide some update. I guess I would generally start with, for most pieces of legislation, it's a several-year slog, and this would have proved to be no different. Every year we hope to see incremental progress. Every once in a while you get lucky and pull it off in the first year, but in many cases it takes years of education, advocacy, support of grassroots supporters like you, talking with your individual legislators to really build the case and support for changes in the Indiana statute. And so we've come a long way from when we first started. I think originally back in 2019, with a bill filed at the time, had a lot of great support from the advocacy community, which really culminated in a day at the State House that was in conjunction with the Clothesline Project, which really highlighted personal individual stories that women had, and I think really helped to take the issue from something that was theoretical in nature, but to really understand the impact of rape and sexual assault to women, the implications and the wake that it leaves for those as they recover. And so from there, went through an interim study committee process where really all the players came to the table. We were in a hearing for several hours at the State House. There was a lot of negotiation, and through that fall, really worked to come to some consensus around what consent should look like in the Indiana Code. We went from having a Democrat member that was in the minority authoring the bill, helping us to build support, to then having Representative Sharon Nagel, a member of the House Republican Caucus, introduce the bill last year. We successfully were able to get it out of the House with a, I believe, unanimous vote or nearly unanimous vote, really with prosecutors, victims advocates, standing and coalescing around this together to say, we do need some clearer definitions in the statute so that women do have the option and ability to really hold those accountable. Unfortunately, we were met with resistance in the Indiana Senate, where it did not receive a hearing. And so we have had some conversations this past fall with the Senate chair. I think he still has some reservations, but Representative Nagel did file and pass House Bill 1079 through the House this first half. It again received unanimous support, and she has sent it over to Senator Glick and Senator Liz Brown, who are strong members of both the Judiciary and Corrections Committees, which are it likely will go. Last year it was sent to Corrections. We're hopeful that maybe we can get a change of venue, which will help to improve our chances. But I do think that it's really important at this stage to engage our grassroots network, particularly to contact your senators, not only Senator Young, who's the committee chair, but your individual senators as well, so that they're hearing from their constituents and they know that people are interested and engaged, that this is a problem that needs to be solved and that a solution is in front of us to solve that.
Thank you so much, Amy. And this question is directed to Beth. I'm going to switch roles a little bit. What preventative measures do you think a bill like House Bill 1079 provides other than the legal backing that Amy was explaining?
Yeah, so I see the necessity of 1079 or defining consent within the statute to be really as much about highlighting the issue and raising the discussion as it is the legal mechanism. I believe at ICASA HT, our mission is prevention, education, and also support of survivor organizations. We are not a direct service organization, but what we know, and Jan set the table for us in a sobering way, which is 1 in 5 women in Indiana will experience sexual assault. 1 in 5. So if you sit with that for just a minute and you think about what kind of culture we've created with not only young people, but just kind of in every institution, it's a culture of permissive behavior that allows this to happen. And it's also important to note that sexual assault is not merely a female victim, male, perpetrator situation, or females a survivor. There are women who perpetrate, and there are men who are survivors, and every, a combination in between. We have trans people are statistically most likely to be victims of sexual assault. So we have to create, it seems to me, a culture in the state of Indiana where this is unacceptable. Sexual assault and human trafficking are not inevitable. We do not have to accept that this is the way life is going to be for 1 in 5 women in particular, and we don't know the statistics for men because the reporting is harder. But we know that it affects hundreds of thousands of people, and we don't have to accept it. And so what I believe the legislation has been doing and can do is raise the awareness, start the conversation, support survivors, and make sure that we are creating a culture where survivors are believed, listened to, and supported. So I think the legislature is a great venue for those conversations to be had. I think it's terrific, and I want to applaud Amy and the work she has done along with others to bring a coalition in support of this. When you talk about these kinds of issues, sometimes people think, well, the law enforcement's against it because it makes their job harder. And, advocacy groups like Women for Change or ICASA HT or Planned Parenthood are in favor of this because they think it makes it easier to prosecute. Well, that's actually not the case. Clarity is important for everyone. Clarity, and I was a prosecutor early in my career. I have been in the courtroom. I have handled not sexual assault cases in particular, but other kinds of criminal cases. Clarity about what is criminal, how we prove a case and what are the elements, and then how those are used to create an environment where accountability exists is good for everyone. It is good for law enforcement, it is good for prosecutors, it is good for survivors, it is good for advocates who are working in the courts, it is good for corrections officials who are trying to help perpetrators move toward restoration and resolution for their behavior. So what I don't understand, frankly, is why we wouldn't want clarity. I think clarity is in everyone's interest, and that is what this legislation is attempting to do. And am perplexed as to who would be against clarity in this environment. And I believe that this kind of conversation helps us bring these issues to the fore.
Thank you so much, Beth, for your answer. You did mention a few things around culture of clarity, but as well as just social culture that we have for women in our country and how we support them and how we empower them and how we keep them safe. So I would love to swing a question to Christine. Christine, what are some of the ways growing up in Kenya has impacted your view of how America treats women?
So growing up in Kenya, even as a young girl, I noticed some of the differences when it came to how even our cultures and traditions, how women were viewed versus how the men were viewed. And so one of the early things growing up was really experiencing, seeing like domestic violence happen really constantly in my community, and then the silence around that. There are some traditional and cultural pieces that were perpetuating those issues. And I was surprised, when I came to the United States, I came here in 2011, that I realized some of that culture is also prevalent here. The silence around sexual violence, the silence around domestic violence, I would say is almost similar or even almost exact, like what I had experienced back home. So the fact that women were experiencing physical harm, sexual harm, harm that is impacting home life, jobs, and careers, and seeing that also prevalent here in the United States was really sobering for me, because that showed that the issue of violence is not just something that happens in the US or something that happens in Kenya. It is something that is a worldwide problem. And if we continue, allowing women to continue suffering, the silence around that, then we are the ones perpetuating this culture. So like Beth mentioned, part of that fixing some of these pieces is, as a community, as a society, we need to come to a place where our norms and our basic piece is that actually
I'm so sorry, Christine. I hate to cut you off, but I'm having trouble hearing. I don't know if anybody else had audio issues, so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the only one.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing Christine, and I want to.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Yes.
Is that better?
So it's less volume, but I can still hear you.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
Okay. What about now?
Yeah, I think this will work.
I can't hear you, Danielle.
Oh no. Let's go ahead. Come back to your question while we figure out that audio.
I fix this.
While Christine is finishing or fixing her audio, I do want to bring up a point that Christine made on culture, and especially around men in her country or in Kenya. Beth, can I go ahead and ask
Danielle,
you?
can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah.
No.
Beth, why don't we go ahead and see if we can talk about the modern definition of consent in young men in this country, and how do we think we can build that awareness?
Yeah, so one of the missions of ICASA HT is prevention and awareness. We have a terrific program for young men run by a gentleman named Burton Patterson, who is our men's engagement coordinator. He is an educator with a background in bullying prevention, and so it's kind of a curriculum focused on high school and college young men to talk about boundaries and appropriate behavior. We have to start young. And when I was talking to Burton recently, I said, well, what about K5, 6? What about middle school? I have a 13-year-old son, and while these conversations are hard, and they are hard, they're really essential that we start young and that we establish for our young men in particular, although again, this is a non-gender specific issue, but because we know so many women are impacted, start with young men and help them understand where the boundaries are and how consent is not only kind of a one-time, the context of behavior, but it's continuous, it can change. The thing to understand about sexual assault in particular, and I know that I am preaching to the choir in some ways, and so I apologize for those of you who know this and have heard this, but it's not about sex, it's about power and control. It is about exercising power over another person. And often these consent issues have to do with impairment. They have to do with cognitive impairment. Women and even men with disabilities are much more likely to be victimized. It has to do with a power dynamic where someone is vulnerable and someone else is in power over that person. And so these are conversations that have to start very early and very consistently within communities where young people are being impacted, that not just the schools, but other organizations. ICASA HT works with Kiwanis, which, as you know, is an international youth serving organization with chapters all across the world. And we implement our curriculum with them at the high school level. We're talking about expanding into the middle school level to get to that group of young people, all, as I said, all across the world, so that they can not only learn themselves about the boundaries of appropriate power dynamics within relationships, but also how to be an advocate and a bystander. We have a great curriculum that we developed called What Would I Do, which talks specifically about human trafficking and what a person who finds himself in a bystander role when there's something occurring that appears to be a power dynamic of someone being victimized. What would I do? How would I intervene? What are the tools that I need to intervene and to provide or offer help? These things are complicated, and I've been in situations where I've witnessed a dynamic that that something told me there was something going on here that didn't seem right. And so training and educating and orienting people to be appropriate bystanders, to be appropriate advocates for those who are vulnerable and lacking in power. These are the same concepts that we need to talk to young men about as it relates to sexual assault. And that culture has to be a part of all the institutions where young people are a part, right? And I want to talk about sports. I'm just going to bring it up. We are the amateur sports capital of the world. I love sports. My son is an athlete. We are, after this session today, going to watch IU and see how they do. Not so great last weekend. They beat Purdue and then they just died against Michigan. But all of that is to say, big time sports at the college, pro, and high school level, there is an element of toxic masculinity where boys will be boys and men will behave and they will do things that victimize people who are vulnerable or people with whom they're in relationship. It's not acceptable and it can't be tolerated. And we've got to stop saying to ourselves, it's just the way athletes behave. It's just the way the culture of big time sports it creates that environment. No, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. I wouldn't accept it from my son or my husband, and therefore I won't accept it in my universities, in my high schools, in my little league, in my youth football league. I'm so excited to hear from Christina because of the work that she does at Iupui. We have great institutions of higher education in this state. I'm proud of that. I'm an IU product. My sister went to Purdue. I know people at Notre Dame, Terre Haute, Ball State. We churn out wonderful leaders for the future. And we have more sexual assault on college campuses than any place else statistically. If you haven't seen the documentary, The Hunting Ground, Google it, watch it. It will terrify you. It is a documentary. It's some years old now. I'd say probably 10 years old, but it's a documentary about college campuses and sexual assault. It's unacceptable. I become so frustrated to hear people say, well, there's nothing we can do. Of course there is something we can do. And what we can do is change the culture, talk about this with our young people early, often, and normalize those conversations. It's nothing to be ashamed of to have those conversations. That's a really long answer to your short question, Danielle. But I really get passionate about the thing we're talking about here.
Yes, Beth, thank you so much for your answer. And all the more reason for the state of Indiana to pass legislation like HB 1079. And before we get deep into our conversation, because I can tell we're going down a really great road, talking about college campuses, talking about younger generations, and this thing we need to have defined at the state, I wanted to ask Amy a question real quick, just to give us all a clear call to action around House Bill 1079. What are the steps that our guests here on the call can do to further consent, and especially those who live within districts with those supportive legislators?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Danielle. So at this stage, we are quickly approaching the halftime of the legislative session. It's hard to believe it's a short session. And so they convened in early January, and they must sine die or adjourn statutorily no later than March 14th. We understand that with primary elections, new districts that legislators are running in, they probably won't be in that long. And so the second half of the session will take off very quickly. And there'll be about a 3-week sprint in the second chamber before we hit the next deadline. And so for those who want to follow the legislation, the legislature's website is iga.in.gov, and I can put that in the chat when I'm done speaking. From there, you can link to bills, committee hearings, committee proceedings. And so what we'll be waiting for is the bill will be sent over to the Senate, and it will be assigned to a committee by the President pro tem. Once we know which committee it has gone to, thank you, Haley, then we will want to start reaching out to members of the committee and the chair, urging them urging he or she, depending on which committee it goes to hold a hearing on that bill. In the meantime, certainly individuals should reach out to your local legislators, regardless of whether they serve on the corrections or judiciary committees in the Senate, but to again engage them, urge their support for the bill, and also ask them to urge that the bill be given a hearing once it's assigned to committee. And so the legislature will next week take a couple days off, which means they won't be meeting Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And so that's a chance for legislators to catch up a little bit. So from a timing perspective, it would be really great to make those contacts really in the next week. And then once we know the committee that the bill has been assigned to, making a follow-up connection, really with the idea that, you know, multiple contacts help to keep it fresh in their minds and help them to keep that on the priority list of the, 400 or so bills that are still going to be alive at the end of next week with a lot going on. And again, from the website that Haley provided, you can click, you go to that's the General Assembly's home website. There's a drop down that says legislation. You scroll through, you can click on the bill number, and from there you can find bill actions, which will reflect the current status of the bill. And from there you can track which committee it's been assigned to. In addition to, I'm sure, information we'll be sending out to all of our advocates and members in the Women for Change Network.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that call to action for us to contact our legislators and urge them to get this bill heard. You obviously have a wealth of information at the state level for all things bills and legislation. For those of us who might not know, could you explain what crossover is and when it is, so that we can get a real good grip on what you want us to do?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I sometimes get too far into the weeds. So in Indiana, I'll just start real basic on a real quick overview. All bills have to pass through the House and the Senate before it goes to the governor for final consideration, where he can either sign it or veto it or allow a bill to go into law without his signature. Before it reaches his desk, the bill is introduced in its house of origin. So in this case, it's House Bill 1079. So that's how you know where it started at. And so it has gone through the process and passed the House. It must go through the same process in the Senate, where on the first step, it'll be assigned to a committee. It must receive a hearing and an affirmative vote out of the committee by a certain deadline date. And then it will go to the floor, where it can be amended by any member of the Senate. And then it will go up for a final vote. If the bill is changed in the Senate from the version that passed the House, it then has to go back over to the House where they make one final vote. And really it's to approve the changes that were made, because both chambers are required to pass the exact same language before it can go down to the governor. Now, I'll veer off path for a second. If there's a disagreement between how it passed the House and changes made in the Senate, they will send it to a conference committee where there will be 4 legislators that are appointed, one from each of the 4 caucuses, the House Republicans, the House Democrats, the Senate Republicans, and the Senate Democrats. And they will try to work out the differences and come to an agreement. And then in that case, the 4 of them reach agreement, and then it goes back for a final vote in both the House and the Senate, so that all 150 members of the General Assembly also have the chance to vote on those changes. If you're tracking a Senate bill, that would be the same. It would start in the Senate, it would go through, it would be assigned to a committee, it would need to receive a hearing, it would go to second reading. If it passes out of committee where it can be amended, and then a final vote on the Senate floor, and then it goes to the House. So we have the same process working in both chambers. And the really key point there is that both houses at the end of the day, or both chambers, have to pass the exact same language, again, before the bill is eligible for consideration by the governor. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that, because I know it sounds very confusing. I need a little flow chart probably.
That's why Amy makes the big bucks. Danielle, may I ask Amy a question?
Yeah.
Great. So Amy, you mentioned that passed the House, great. Couldn't get a hearing in the Senate last year. And by the way, I have had a lot of experience in the legislature, and you are absolutely right that it is passing something in the first, even the second year is a tough slog, and it takes time for these things to sort of gel. Where is the opposition coming from in the Senate? What is articulated opposition that we can address when we are reaching out to our senators? Give us some ammunition to kind of head off at the pass what the opponents are saying.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Senator Young has said to me that the term consent is ambiguous, and that it creates more confusion than clarity in the statute, and that he doesn't believe that the definition in it as it passed last year actually helps to, again, provide certainty or clarity for those who would like to use the statute to be able to go in and pursue a case against their attacker. It's interesting because the prosecutors have actually testified in the past, I believe, that it actually does help them with providing some additional parameters under which a rape case can be brought in a courtroom. The Public Defenders Commission, or Public Defenders Council rather, is opposed to the language. They kind of align with Senator Young there. So we have some interesting kind of alliances there that are not typical as we work through the legislative session. And so I think, another avenue is to engage with your local county prosecutor to help try to have them also contact their legislators, other advocacy groups, law enforcement that you may know, that can convey to in particular the Senate, why this language makes the consent statute much clearer than it is today, and provides an avenue for relief under the criminal statute for those who would like to pursue that. And so I think, again, hopefully we can work with and reach out to the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, in addition to some of the advocacy community, and really make a concerted effort and push with Senator Young to try to get him to, change his mind on that. Now, he said he's open to looking at ways to tighten up the statute. He just doesn't believe that this is the mechanism for it. I think, the next step is for us to push him, now that we have a bill that's passed the House, to really say, then if this language doesn't work, what language would accomplish our goal that you have stated that you believe and agree on to get us over the finish line.
Thank you so much, Amy. We do have an audience question and concerns to the legislative process. How can bills go into effect without the governor's signature?
So by statute, the governor in Indiana has what's referred to as a weak governor system. They only need 51 votes, 50 plus 1 votes in each the House and the Senate to override a gubernatorial veto. The governor also doesn't have line item veto authority. So you may hear in other states, or the president will line item veto a particular provision out of a bill. In Indiana, the governor must take a bill in its totality and make a determination as to whether he will sign it, not sign it, or veto it. There are a specific language that says that within 7 days of receipt of a bill, the governor must take action. If he fails to take definitive action, either by signing it or vetoing it, it then becomes law. And so in some cases, the governor may choose to do that if, they have it historically has been used, and I will not say that necessarily this has been used by Governor Holcomb, because I'm not sure if he's actually used this pathway, but historically, governors will do that if there's some uncertainty that, they feel that the legislature has spoken, but perhaps are not in total agreement with something, but recognizing the legislative process and, the likelihood of it being, the veto being overridden and so that in and of itself sends a statement that while they will respect the determination of the legislature, that ultimately it may not have been something that they were in total agreement with.
Great information. So while we're talking about government and taking a quick intro to government class with Professor Levander, we do need to discuss why is this so important to have in our state and those real stories and real impacts that people are facing. So I would love to see if Christine is back with us and her audio is working, and ask if as someone with experience in the psychological field, how would you define the lasting psychological impact of the mistreatment of women and all that is encapsulated in that? Oh, Christine, I'm still not hearing you.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about that.
Welcome back, Christine.
Yes, the Zoom gods have had mercy on me. Okay, so the psychological impact of sexual violence, I always want folks to think about it in terms of some of the short-term immediate effects that would happen and the long-term effects. And so we're not just talking about the psychological impact, there's a lot of a survivor's life that is impacted. So when you're thinking about immediately, the physical health, are people able to even sleep, having flashbacks? Are you able to go to work? Are you able to continue your day-to-day life? There's a sense of safety that is gone the moment a survivor is violated. And that impacts you in significant ways in your day-to-day. So immediately, there's some immediate effects that happen for a survivor. Are you able to even stay in your home? Do you have a home to stay? Do you need to start looking for resources in terms of shelter, in terms of safe places to go? Is your workplace a safe place to go? So just immediately, there's some adverse effects once a survivor experiences sexual assault. There are financial effects that happen. I need to go see a doctor. Do I have insurance? Do I trust that the doctors who see me are going to believe me and not blame me? So there's a lot of that happens. And so when you're thinking about some of the long-term effects, so that includes, depression, anxiety for a lot of folks experiencing PTSD. And survivors are very resilient because they have to be. And sometimes the smallest things would trigger you. Like you would be going on in your day-to-day and you see or you hear something that triggers you in such a way that it impacts
what you're doing, that you're not able to focus on work, you're not able to focus on your schoolwork. So those are some of the pieces. Increased isolation. You don't want to hang around people because you're not feeling safe. There's a danger of increased risky behavior. So increased drug, alcohol use, increased sexually risky behaviors because of what has impacted your survivor. So when you're thinking about not just the immediate impact for a survivor having been violated, it continues on for so long. And one of the questions that survivors ask is, will this feeling go away? How do I make this not happen to me again? And I'll share, a student once asked me, someone who had experienced sexual violence more than 2 times, what is it about me that makes this happen to me over and over again? What am I doing wrong? And so for someone to be going through life thinking that they are the problem and they've been perpetrated against, you can see some of that, the impact that it has for young people and even older people. So there are significant adverse effects for survivors.
Christine, was that, I want to make sure that your audio didn't cut out again.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Christine, for your answer. I want to jump back into Beth's conversation that we were discussing before we got our call to action from Amy about what you're doing with the coalition and bringing this idea of consent more to light, especially with young people, high schoolers, and how you're organizing for this in the state.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to say to Christine, thank you for the perspective that you're giving. It is people who are survivors, that the long, short, sort of short-term, medium-term, and then long-term impacts can really be devastating. And one of the things that we see so often is a self-blame, and therefore also then a self-medicating through alcohol, drugs, other kinds of, as she was indicating, risky behavior. And it really comes from the stigma associated with this behavior. And I am going to answer your question, Danielle, because what I believe is part of the answer to the stigma is discussion about the issue and about consent. This notion that survivors blame themselves, that they believe that what we do in society is we focus on the victim and the survivor. Where were you going? What were you wearing? Did you walk by yourself? On college campuses, this is so common. We train women to be prepared for self-defense. We train them not to walk alone. We train them not to be at the library late at night. We talk to them about what they're wearing. Watch your drink. How much are you drinking? Why aren't we talking to young men who are most likely to be the perpetrators about their behavior? That is, in my opinion, the solution to this problem. And Danielle, in answer to your question, ICASA HT has existed for about 6 years, and we were created and formed for the purpose of doing prevention and other kinds of discussions. So we didn't start our discussions and our training and our advocacy because of this legislation. We started it because what we know to be true is that the numbers in Indiana are terrifying, and we can do better. We have to do better. It's going to take work on, and on the part of everyone, but we do believe strongly that the work in part is talking to young men who are most likely to be the perpetrators. And so those discussions have been had for some years, and we are, as I said, we have a great men's engagement coordinator who's doing a lot of really important work with fraternities and sororities on our college campuses, fraternities in particular. He's a young man who played football in college. He has an amazing story about going to play football and seeing a behavior, a culture of behavior that he couldn't tolerate. And then being an educator, being a social worker, and then coming to the work after some years of understanding that we've got to talk prevention. And so those are some of the things that ICASA HT is doing. There are lots of other organizations doing important work in this area as well. ICASA HT doesn't do direct service. We support the rape crisis centers, which is the network all around the state of Indiana, who are the advocates on the front line when a person has experienced the trauma of assault. The rape crisis centers are the places within Indiana where they go to get help. I also should say, Danielle, and I should have led with this, and I'm apologizing. If anyone within the sound of my voice needs help because of this issue, I want to offer the resource that we always offer, which is the first thing to do is to call the RAIN hotline. Now, RAIN, for those who don't know, stands for Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. RAIN is an advocacy organization similar to ICASA HT, who has a national reach. They run a hotline. The good news about the hotline is because it's national, it will route you to where the closest help is. So I know that the good news, bad news about the Zoom environment that we're in, that people from all over the country can log on to this call. It used to be we'd be in a room and most people would live in Marion County, or they'd live in Indianapolis, or they'd live in Hamilton County. Well, now people could be listening and hearing us from all over the country. So the RAIN hotline is the place to start. And that number is 1-800-656-HOPE, which is funny because I'm old enough to remember when you actually use the little numbers and letters on your keypad to dial the phone. We don't do that anymore. So it is 1-800-656-4673. The RAIN hotline will route you to the rape crisis center closest to you where you can get help. One thing that I think Christina was talking about earlier, or Christine was talking about, the issue of our healthcare providers. We know that emergency rooms are the gateway for a lot of victims, survivors. The person experiencing this trauma kind of moves from being a victim to being a survivor on their own time, right? So we use the terms interchangeably, but when a trauma has occurred at that immediate moment, they are a victim of that trauma. So going to an emergency room, most of our hospitals are great to engage what's called a RAIN, or it stands for, I'm sorry, not RAIN, excuse me. It stands for a nurse trauma expert. It's a certification that nurses can get. They're called SANE, S-A-N-E, which is Sexual Assault Nurse Educator. They're trained in this certification in the emergency rooms. And when you go to a hospital or a clinic, and those people are available to you. Candidly, Indiana doesn't do the greatest job of making those resources available as some other states do. And so sometimes people have to wait. Sometimes, if you've been in an emergency room in the last couple of years due to COVID, it's the last place that you want to be, right? They're scary, they're overloaded, the nurses and other first responders are exhausted. And so if you're already experiencing trauma, it may or may not be the place where you feel like you're getting the help you need. Call the hotline. You will be routed to a rape crisis center. There we go, SANE. Thank you, Kristen. Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. That's what I wanted to say about SANE. That's what SANE stands for. But I'm talking now specifically about people who need help in the immediate term. I will put the phone number of the RAIN crisis hotline in the chat. It's available to people who are experiencing this or who know people who need help. What ICASA HT does is support the rape crisis centers. One other thing to say when we talk about this kind of consent legislation, other states around the country have done this already. This is not a crazy or radical thing. We see in Indiana, I'm old enough to remember when we got daylight savings time, and it was this big thing about how, oh, that's so radical, how crazy. Well, everybody else in the country has daylight savings time. So Indiana just kind of comes along, at the back end, and oh, I guess we should probably do that too. Illinois has consent defined in their statute. I believe Ohio, other Midwestern states who aren't crazy have done this already. Indiana needs to do better having rape crisis centers in every county. We don't. We need them. We are working on it, and I say we, it's kind of within the portfolio of ICASA HT to support them, but there needs to be more funding to establish rape crisis centers around the state so that people in crisis, 19 states, thank you Rima, and Washington DC have defined consent in their statute. So almost half of the states in this country, right? So Indiana would not be going kind of out on a limb by ourselves if we were to do this. So again, a long answer to your short question. There's a lot to say, but I want people to know what the help looks like when there's that immediate term that Christine was talking about with a trauma that has occurred.
Thank you so much, Beth. We do have a follow-up question from the audience. Is any progress being made to process rape kits, which could provide evidence against a rapist? The
short answer is I don't know. It is on my list in the next couple of weeks for me to find out the answer. I think we are doing better than we were, which is not saying much, because I would tell you that as a state, we were really just not doing very well at all in the last couple of years. I will commit to finding out and getting the information back to this group.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you for putting that number out there for people who are in need of the services from RAINN and are in crisis and might have a need for that hotline. I could tell that both of you are very passionate about this work. Christine, I would love to know, as someone committed to sexual assault prevention and victim advocacy, how do you engage your university students at IUPUI around this issue?
So the IU university system, so the first thing is with the policies that are in place. So it's important that as an institution, we do have a discrimination, harassment, and sexual misconduct policy that highlights some of those prohibited behaviors. And I think that's really important. So that's one way. So making sure that students are aware of the policy and what their rights are and obligations if they experience some form of sexual misconduct. In terms of engaging students, we have a great group of students who are passionate about this because this is an issue on college campuses. So there are different ways that we do that, and that includes programming. So there's definitely a lot of programming available for students around consent, around bystander intervention, healthy relationships and boundaries, because one of the things that come up when we're talking with college students is either one, they've not had conversations around consent, or even just communicating what their boundaries are and what that looks like, what a healthy relationship looks like. So we definitely do some programming around that. And then we also talk about resources with our students. So it's important as a campus that we have the resources on our campus to support students. So at IUPUI, we have, my role as the confidential advocate, we have counseling available, but it's also important for us to connect with community organizations. So we work really closely with like the Julian Center, the Children's Bureau, and Families First. And so engaging with students so they're aware that if they experience some form of sexual misconduct, that they have access to resources on our campus and also in the community as well. Students are engaged in programming. Student organizations are really raising the issue of sexual misconduct and how they don't want this to continue happening on our campus. So that is one of the ways that we do that. And then really with the training, also connecting with our faculty and staff, because any person interacting with our students also needs to be aware of the resources and also how to support our students. So we have different student organizations that are actively involved, including a Women for Change chapter, some fraternities and sororities, and also athletics department that really put out programming and share resources. The main goal, honestly, when I think about prevention, is to create an understanding for our students that we all have a role to play. We all can do something. No one needs to do everything, but if we each commit to doing something to prevent sexual violence, prevent DV, stalking, then we are on the right track. The goal is that the culture at IU, the culture at IUPUI is that we don't tolerate that violence. And there's a lot of work to be done for that, for us to get to that part. So students are engaged and we'll continue working towards that. So I think a lot of resources are needed on our campuses. Continued conversations around this topic are also important.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Mm-hmm.
This question is for both of you, and feel free, whoever wants to jump on to it first. But if a bill like House Bill 1079 does get passed in the state of Indiana, which Amy laid out a great roadway for us to get this actually to the governor, what are the next steps? What happens after the bill gets passed? And even in an alternate space, what would we do if it doesn't get passed? What is the call to actions for us to continue to educate people and organize around keeping people safe and keeping victims of sexual assault protected by law?
I'll start. First thing we do if it passes is we celebrate. And we talk about it as much as we can in as many venues as we can, and we raise sort of the flag of victory on behalf of survivors and others in the state of Indiana. That's the first thing we do. And we really thank Amy Levander and send her flowers or something. So those are kind of the first things that we do. But in all seriousness, we talk about how important this kind of legislative action is. That I've worked in the legislature a long time, not nearly as deeply as Amy, but one thing that I think is really important that we don't do often enough is when things happen that are good, we thank the legislators who kind of stick out their necks. Is that the way I might have said it? Worked hard to get things accomplished, right? So we have a couple of legislators who are carrying the water in the House. They did a great job getting it through. Now we've got a few female legislators that were mentioned earlier, Senator Glick, Senator Brown. They're going to carry the water in the Senate. If this is successful, we need to thank them. We need to recognize the work. Politics is the art of the compromise, and it's possible, and things happen, but they may have had to use some influence and some compromise and some of their energy and their influence to get this done, and we need to thank them for that. If it doesn't pass, we live to fight another day, and we go back next year. That is the short answer to that. We work closely with the Prosecuting Attorneys Council at ICASA HT. We have a statewide organization called a SART, which is the State Advocacy. I don't know. I know the acronyms. I don't know what they stand for. So START stands for Sexual Assault Resource Team. It is a statewide team. We're on it. So are the prosecutors, a lot of other people, the sheriffs. And so we need to, within that context, talk about what we've accomplished, what the prosecutors need to now understand and do as it relates to these cases, how law enforcement needs to be trained to understand what this new law is going to mean for them in the investigation and the interaction with survivors. So there's a lot of sort of education and awareness that needs to be done, and we'll play a role in doing it, and so will a lot of other organizations. But if it doesn't pass, we live to fight another day. That is always my mantra with people in politics and in the legislative arena. Live to fight another day. Keep the relationships positive and open. We go back at it. That's what I've got.
Yes, and I would say something similarly, like if this passes, we celebrate because it's a step forward. It's important for survivors to know that Indiana as a state is really thinking about them and understanding the impact that sexual violence has, and that we want to hold people accountable for the harms that they are causing. So I think that's it's worthy a celebration, especially for survivors who do not engage in the legal, criminal, civil process because they don't feel that they are protected. And then awareness and education about what does this really mean on the ground. A law, the law is great, but what does this mean for the day-to-day for survivors or loved ones of survivors? That how do they implement? How do they then go forward to claim the protections of the law? So that's the other piece. And then I think also understanding that the law is great, but on its own, it doesn't really do much. So then how are we making sure that we actually have the resources that support survivors actually reaching out for these legal services? A lot of survivors will not go to the prosecutor's office because one, time is money. They don't have the resources. If it's a civil process, access to legal representation. So there are a lot of additional barriers that are in place. So then once we have this law in place, then what else are we doing as a state to provide access to, resources, access to services, so that then this just doesn't become a law in name only. It actually becomes a law that is implemented and survivors feel that it is for them as well. If this law doesn't pass, then our commitment must remain the same, that we are working to end sexual violence in our community. We are working to make sure that the culture of violence is not one that we tolerate, and that we keep pushing for changes within our legal system. And through that, ensuring that we are in any shape or form providing resources to our local organizations that are working with survivors right now. And that includes the schools, includes the shelters, the transitional housing organizations that we have, and those also that are providing prevention education.
Thank you, Christina, for reminding me that the vast majority of these situations do not get reported, and many, of course, even if reported, do not successfully go to prosecution. I was a prosecutor early in my career. It is a re-traumatizing process to go through the criminal justice system and to hold your perpetrator accountable. I am very sympathetic to those folks who cannot do it, cannot find themselves can't find the strength to do it. And there also are situations where it happens in a context where they don't report in time for the statute of limitations to allow criminal system accountability. And so survivors are at various places in their journeys, and just because we have a statute now that could help some people successfully prosecute, so many more people affected by this issue do not go through the criminal justice system. So that's another important way that we acknowledge people need help and how we can provide that help.
Yes. Sobering statistics all around that just highlight the need for this consent to be defined at the state level. I want to go ahead and end with a final question to both of you, Beth and Christine. And then after we answer this question, we will open it up for guest questions. So as Beth and Christine are answering this question, if you do have a question that you would like to ask our panelists, and I believe Amy Levander will be joining us again too to answer any of those legislative questions, please put it in the chat, use your raise hand feature, or just come off mute when the time arrives to have a Q&A. So for Beth and Christine, what are your hopes for Indiana's future? And do you think they're realistic?
Christine, I'm going to let you go first.
Yes, hope. I want Indiana to have a consent, legislation. I want that. And I believe we can do that if we keep pushing for this. I want, my hope is that the culture that allows us or makes us tolerate violence, even in the smallest forms, really ends. And that means, what am I doing individually in my sphere of influence? And then what am I doing in my office, in the department? If we can all think about that, I think we can make a really big difference. So I think my call to action for everyone, when I'm thinking about my hopes for Indiana, for survivors and where we are going, is really think about your sphere of influence, from your home life to your school, to your work, to the places that you socialize. What can you do sort of impact these prevention efforts that you can do day to day, from the smallest of things, which includes, talking about what a healthy relationship looks like, celebrating that, and not minimizing anyone who shares concerns about unhealthy pieces that are happening. So I would say, like those two, I feel there's hope, but we have to do the work.
I can't add anything to that because it was excellent. I agree with her 100%. The thing that gives me hope is young people. You know, I'm old, and I have a 13-year-old son, and I have watched in his lifetime things that I never thought would be accepted and normalized become accepted. Things like LGBTQ rights. I was privileged to be the clerk of Marion County when marriage equality became a thing. I did 650 weddings in 3 days, and we just, you know, people got married and it was a thing. And, you know, when I was growing up, people would have said that, you know, the sky was going to fall and, you know, the planet would explode if we allowed marriage equality to be a thing. And my son and others of his generation have created an environment where we are open and accepting of those kinds of things that some people could never imagine. This is a similar issue. We can change the culture of violence in this state and in this country. It's going to require all of us, as Christine said, and it's going to require the new generation or the young generation to be taught differently. And that gives me hope.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Christine, for your thoughtful considerations on that question. So we will be moving into the guest Q&A portion of this panel. I do want to kick it off with a guest question in the chat. One of our guests asked about the common occurrence of sexual assault when women and girls who are under 18 that is done by a family member. And most of those people that have been a victim of this type of abuse and assault will not talk about it because of it is their family, or they're feared to be shamed or keep it a secret. What advice do you have, or what steps do you have for people in this scenario in the state, and what can be done around this issue?
Christine, please.
Okay, so that is a really hard situation for survivors who experience sexual violence within the home life, because then you have to understand if it's a parent or a relative, you're relying on them for your financial, your housing. That really impacts, like, if I report this, then where do I go? And so that's a really challenging piece. And then you're asking someone, you know, if I report this, I may break ties with those who are closest to me. So it's a really difficult position to be in for a survivor in that situation. I would encourage, if you know someone going through that, reach out to an advocate organization, reach out to, you know, like the Julian Center, RAIN, the Children's Bureau, just to talk, first of all, about what options are available for you as a survivor, and then understanding that it's complicated, that you may still experience mixed emotions where, you know I've experienced harm from someone in my family, but I still love this person. And what does that mean for me as the survivor? Am I saying that I'm okay with this? So there are a lot of mixed, complicated emotions and factors to consider, because if someone in that situation wants to leave that situation, there's a lot more that has to be considered. So connecting them to a resource. And then there are options there, providing support, counseling, therapy, and there are a lot of therapy options that are free that work with survivors. So I would say connect with an organization, and then really be understanding that this is a really complicated matter for a survivor in that situation.
Those are all great points. The other thing to remind ourselves is that if the victim is a minor, and even if it's in the home or not in the home, the child protection process is triggered, right? And I did that work early in my career as well. I've been around a long time, and the case managers at DCS, the Division of Child Services, are trained to identify this the victimization that goes on. It is really tough when it is a minor child. I mean, Christine talked about a person having agency to make decisions about what they're going to do. Well, legally, a child is under the age of 18 doesn't have any agency, and they are at the mercy of the system, and the system will get involved, and it's really hard. So the good news is DCS works hard to train their case managers. They do the best job they can. But what we see about survivors as adults, many of them were victimized as children. That this is a pattern that is established early, and it takes years and years of work to break free of the survivor guilt and other trauma.
Thank you so much for those pointers and direction for anyone. I wanted to bring up go in a little different direction, but still under the same umbrella. As a previous comprehensive sexual education facilitator, consent was always a conversation that we would have in the classroom and with kids and those who are willing to hear about comprehensive sex education. What are your thoughts on the sexual education status in Indiana and what the current conversations hold?
Well, I can say that at least we do it. And my son is an IPS student. He's a 7th grader. We have healthy relationship education, and I have access to the curriculum, and I'm 100% in favor of us doing it and then some. I remember a time when it was really controversial that we did it at all. So again, live to fight another day. It could be more fulsome as far as the discussions are concerned, but it's better than nothing, is what I would say about Indiana.
Yeah, I would just say that there's also, there have been recent threats to sex ed curriculum in schools. 2, maybe 3 years ago, there was legislation that would have required parental consent for sex ed to be taught. What we were able to negotiate was a opt-out provision so that parents could opt their children out rather than having to have all children opted in, because we know that for many children that are at the highest risk, they're the ones who may not have that ability to get that timely consent and get into that programming in the high schools. It reared itself up again this last summer with, some of the far right conservative movement around CRT, mental health screening, and access to sex ed classes. And so there are things that we have to remain vigilant on. Additionally, I would say there have been attempts, bipartisan, by both Senator Jean Breaux and Senator Jean Lysing in the Senate, to pass legislation that would require the Department of Health to develop culturally appropriate sex education curriculums. It's not moved in the Senate, but I think it's, something that is certainly worthy of consideration. And, we're hopeful that those discussions will, pick up some steam in the future. It won't happen this session, but I think that there are opportunities to provide more than what we're doing right now, to Beth's point.
Christine, feel free to add to the conversation.
Yeah, I would say more needs to be done. So in my role, when I meet with college students, freshmen who've experienced some form of sexual misconduct and some who've experienced that before even coming to campus, one of the conversations that is common is the fact that conversations around consent and boundaries have not happened before. So that means there's a gap in terms of education. That means it needs to happen in schools as early as possible, age appropriate, in a way that, children and students can understand what's going on. It also needs to happen in the home as well. So I would say more needs to be done when it comes to sex education.
Thank you so much. We have another audience question. Is anyone focusing specifically on women in prison being raped and assaulted and the number of incarcerated women who were victims of abuse?
Well, I'm going to start that one because that is it's timely, and it also is something that ICASA HT is working on. We last week, it is by the way, Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So just for a couple more days, we've had a curriculum this month every Thursday run by Kate Kimmer, who is our human trafficking coordinator, talking about issues of human trafficking. And last Thursday, the topic was incarcerated, criminal justice involved incarcerated women and pathways out of their experience in incarceration toward healing, because we know that many women incarcerated, specifically for the tragedy of human trafficking in particular, is that similar to other kinds of drug trafficking and other things, is that the criminal justice system sometimes focuses on the small actors who may actually be victims themselves, right? So think about the girl in their early 20s whose trafficker is using her to get to other potential victims, creating a culture of sort of, bringing others in to be victimized. And then that young person is therefore prosecuted and put in prison, right? So it's all very complicated, but we did last Thursday a session on that. It was terrific. I am going to make it available to Haley here at the Women for Change. We did a recording so that those of you who are interested can watch that discussion from our human trafficking educators. That's a small answer to a very large question, which is how that population represents the people who've been traumatized and who find themselves self-medicating, already experiencing mental illness, drug addiction, alcoholism, that leads to incarceration because of other behaviors. And then they're kind of, already behind the 8 ball as it turns out. So it's a complicated question, but I guess HT is addressing it in terms of the human trafficking element.
So moving through with another question from the audience: stealthing, which is defined as an unspoken removal of a condom during intercourse. This is the definition of stealthing. This can lead to unwanted STIs and pregnancies. Is legislation, or do you believe that this type of legislation is possible in Indiana?
Amy, I got to tell you, as uncomfortable as legislators like Senator Young get talking about issues of consent and sexual assault, I think his head might explode if we started talking about stealthing. I don't know. Amy, that's your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think that's right. We've got to take incremental steps, but I think that the conservative nature of the legislature would take a lot of, I think, education of members to understand what it is, why it's a problem, and probably a multi-year effort to try to get us to where that would be a likely scenario or likely outcome. So I don't think any time in the near future.
Okay, I'm going to open up the audio space for anybody who would like to come off mute and ask questions. Or if you would like to use chat or raise hand feature too, those are options. I'm not seeing anybody, so I think I'm going to close off the panel and hand it back to Haley to close this out.
Thank you, Danielle. I just want to tell a little story. During our clothesline program at the Indiana State House in March of 2020, a young girl who was about 5 years old drove down from Gary with her mother to fill out a postcard. So if anybody knows about the Clothesline Project, I dropped the link in the chat earlier, but you fill out a pink postcard with a story, often of sexual assault. And so this 5-year-old was a victim and survivor of sexual assault. And this is why we advocate for consent legislation, one of the thousands of reasons. And so why we need your assistance in advocating for consent legislation and why it is such an important issue here in our state. Can we give another round of applause though for Danielle and our wonderful speakers today, or a virtual round of applause? Thank you. I also wanted to thank our planning committee, Jan Clark, Rena Venable, and Elcira Villarreal, I'm sorry. My name is Haley Boer. I'm the Vice President of Women for Change, and it's been a pleasure hosting you all for this conversation this evening on consent. I wanted to leave you with a couple action items. First, if you have not already signed up to be an action advocate, you can do so with the link that will be in the chat box. Action advocates are our volunteers who engage with us during the legislative session. So far this year, action advocates have taken action on legislation that Women for Change follows closely over 100 times this session. So please advocate with us. Second, Women for Change will be hosting a virtual Love Letters to Legislators event on Valentine's Day, which will be Monday, February 14th at noon. We will send out that information in a follow-up email, but we'll be writing at lunchtime on crucial pieces of legislation, such as elements of rape and consent. Third, you've helped us get within $300 of our fundraising goal for today, so please consider making a contribution with the link that will be in the chat. We hope to see you, fingers crossed, in person for our next Listen, Connect, and Participate program, which will be Wednesday, March 23rd, on the topic of Get Out the Vote. And so that information will be coming soon in the newsletter. Thank you all. Thank you, our speakers again, and Danielle for doing a great job with this conversation, and have a great rest of your evening.